Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to Fairy Tale Hour on the channel this evening. Tonight I will be reading my retelling, sort of The Little Mermaid. This was something that I wrote back in February 9th, 2005. So I guess it isn't so much a retelling, but like, if you are reading like children's books and things like that, sometimes at the very beginning it'll be like retranslated by so-and-so. So that's kind of what this is. So without much to do, let's just get into it. The Little Mermaid. Far, far from land, where the sea is as blue as the petals of a cornflower and as clear as glass, there, where no anchor can reach the bottom, live the Mer people. Once upon a time, there lived a sea king who ruled over a wondrous underwater kingdom. Living with him in his coral palace was his old mother and his 6 beautiful mermaid daughters. Among the king's daughters, the youngest was the most beautiful. She had skin as soft and as pink as a rose, eyes as deep as the ocean, and her voice surpassed her sisters, as well as other mermaids. Now, it was a well-known fact at the bottom of the sea that when a mermaid or merman reached his or her 15th year, they were allowed to go to the surface and see the world above. And it so happened that that time was coming around quickly for the 6 mermaid daughters. The Little Mermaid was the most excited, for she loved when her grandmother told them stories about the world above. Oh, how she longed to go up, but she was the youngest and had to wait the longest. Finally, the day arrived when the first daughter was allowed to visit the world above. When she came back down, the other daughters asked her what she had seen. "I saw a beautiful sunset," she said. "The clouds were turning a beautiful shade of purple as the orange sun set into the water. It was so beautiful." When the Little Mermaid heard this, she became ecstatic and wished with all her heart that she could go up and see, but she still had to wait her turn. Next, it was the second daughter's turn to rise to the surface. When she returned, the others all inquired about what she had seen. "I saw a green, green forest. The trees all around the lagoon were tall and seemed to touch the sky. There were also many strange animals on the land, ones that walked on all 4 legs and were as sleek-looking as dolphin skin, with strange branches protruding from their heads. Strange as these creatures were, they were somehow very majestic and beautiful, and so unafraid of my presence there." When the Little Mermaid heard this tale, she sighed and wished more than ever that she could go up to the top. Now it was the third daughter's turn to take a look upon the world above the waves. When she returned, she was quick to explain about the white marble palace that she had seen. "It looked as smooth as sand, and there must have been so many creatures that occupied it, but it was hard to tell as I didn't get very close." The Little Mermaid squirmed with excitement. Oh, how she could hardly wait until it was her turn. Next, it was the 4th daughter's turn to travel to the surface. When she returned, she said that the world above was terrible, and she didn't know why anyone would want to live up there. "When I went up, there was a terrible storm," she explained. "There were shafts of light that broke the sky and made horrible, frightening sounds in the dark night. The wind whipped all around me and made it impossible to swim, and the sea was very unkind and lashed bitterly at the land as well. I will never venture up there ever again." When the little mermaid heard this tale, she was very sad, but she still wanted to go and see for herself and make her own decision about what she thought about the world above. Next, it was the fifth daughter's turn to venture up to the top of the sea. When she returned, she explained about the creatures that lived on the land that looked like mermaids, but had 2 tails instead of 1. "Those are called humans," their grandmother explained, "and they do not have 2 tails, but something called legs that they walk on land with. They are a strange race and try to master the sea, but this cannot be done, I'm afraid, for the sea is but a mystery that can never be solved." At long last, the day came when it was the little mermaid's turn to rise to the surface. Before she left, her grandmother gave her a pretty string of pearls to wear. "Be sure to come home soon," she said. The little mermaid smiled. "I will," she said, and kissed her grandmother goodbye, and swam to the surface as light and as swiftly as a bubble. Arriving at the surface, she broke through the water and observed her surroundings. She saw the most beautiful sunset her first sister had spoken of, and smiled as its fading brightness warmed her face. Suddenly, she caught sight of an enormous ship anchored in the middle of the ocean. Curious, she swam towards it. As soon as she was close enough, she peered into the round porthole and saw an enormous gathering of people inside. In the center of all these people was a very handsome boy, a prince, who was celebrating his birthday as well. When the little mermaid saw him, she was touched by his beauty and found that she could not take her eyes off him. Then, as often happens at sea, a terrible storm broke out. The same storm that the little mermaid's sister had spoken of. Lightning filled the sky, and the ocean waters began to rise. The great ship tossed and pitched in the waves that rose like huge mountains, slapping the ship harder and harder and harder, until finally the ship was forced to yield to the ocean and split in 2. When this happened, the little mermaid could only think of the young prince and the fate that might befall him. Diving deep into the waters, she searched frantically for him until she spotted a floating form in the water. She swam towards it. Recognizing that it was he, she pulled him to the surface and held his head above the water as she waited through the night for the storm to subside. In the morning, the little mermaid carried him to shore. She rested his head on the warm sand and placed a gentle kiss on his forehead. Just then, a church bell rang, and a group of girls came strolling along the beach. Not wanting to be seen, the little mermaid returned to the water and hid behind a large rock. The girls on the shore gasped when they saw a strange man lying on the beach, but one of them, who was very pretty and had deep blue eyes just like the little mermaid's, approached the prince just as he revived. All the little mermaid could do was watch as the prince smiled at the girl and took the hand that she offered him. The little mermaid's heart ached. "He believes that she saved him," she thought in anguish. "He will never know it was I." And with this sorrowful thought, she took one last look at the prince before she swam back home. Unknown to everyone else, the little mermaid had a grotto in a part of the sea that was her spot to just be alone. In the middle of her grotto, red seaweed grew, and in the middle of this seaweed was an 8-foot-tall stone statue of a boy. This was the little mermaid's most precious treasure, And day by day, she stayed in her grotto more and more, thinking only of the prince. She would clutch the stone figure to her breast and wish more than anything else that she could see him just once more. Sometimes she would become so grief-stricken that she wanted to cry, but seeing how mermaids can't cry, she was all the more miserable. Days, then weeks went by, but she felt no better. One day, however, one of her sisters came to her and told her that she knew where the prince lived. The little mermaid could not dare to hope, but sure enough, there he was in his big marble palace. She went every night to see him. He was always on his balcony, staring out at sea. Oh, how she yearned to be next to him once more. "Grandmother," the little mermaid asked one day, "can humans live forever?"
"No," her grandmother replied. "Humans die, as we do, but unlike mermaids, who live for 300 years, then turn to sea foam when we die, they have a soul that lives forever in the heavens after death."
"Could I ever get a human soul?" the little mermaid asked. The grandmother thought for a moment.
"Only if a human fell in love with you and took you to be his wife. Then, and only then, would part of his soul flow into your body and create in you a human soul. This, however, can never be, my child, for you are a mermaid, and mermaids can never live on the shore."
That night, the little mermaid could not sleep. She could only think of the prince and how much she wanted to be near him. Finally, after much debate with herself, the little mermaid decided that she would go and see the dreaded sea witch to ask for her help. The sea witch lived in a place that the little mermaid had never dared to venture to before. Her house was made out of the bones of drowned sailors, and in her garden, hundreds of sea snakes hissed and slithered, making the little mermaid even more frightened than she already was. Just when she decided to turn back, the sea witch appeared through the mist that lingered around her house. "I know what you want," she croaked. "A pair of human legs so that you can walk upon the shore, win the love of the prince, and attain that soul that you so desperately desire." The little mermaid nodded eagerly. "I must warn you," the witch continued, "that you shall be very sorry you ever asked me for my help, but I will grant your wish, nevertheless. I will make you a potion that will turn your tail into a pair of legs, but every time you walk it will hurt terribly." The little mermaid swallowed hard, but she nodded. "Remember," the sea witch warned, "you must win the love of the prince in order to remain a human, and if the prince marries someone else, the next morning you will be foam on the sea." The little mermaid turned very pale, but she said, "I'm ready." The sea witch grinned evilly and added, "But in return for this generous favor, you must pay me." The little mermaid's eyes downcast when she realized that she had nothing to give. "I have nothing," she said sadly.
"Oh, but you do?"
the sea witch said. The little mermaid looked up.
"You have the most beautiful voice in the 7 seas, she said. "I want it in return for my helping you."
"But without my voice, what will I have left?" the little mermaid cried. "Your lovely body, your deep blue eyes, and your grace," the sea witch said. The little mermaid thought for a moment. "Very well," she said finally. "It's yours." Grabbing a nearby knife, the sea witch cut out the little mermaid's tongue, and after receiving her payment, she gave the little mermaid the potion and bid her be gone from her lair. As the little mermaid swam away, she blew 1,000 kisses towards her home, knowing full well that she would never return. Then afterwards, she swam to the steps of the prince's palace. When the little mermaid reached the steps of the palace, she opened the bottle that contained the magic potion and drank it quickly. The burning liquid seared through her delicate body, and she fell over in a dead faint. When the little mermaid woke, she could no longer feel her tail. She looked down, and in its place were a pair of slender white legs. Standing above her was the prince. "Who are you?" he asked. "Where did you come from?" But the little mermaid could not speak. All she could do was gaze up at him lovingly with her sad blue eyes. Deciding that it would be very unkind to leave her naked and alone, he gently took her by the hand and led her into the palace. The little mermaid then realized what the witch had warned her about the pain was true. With every step she took, it felt as though sharp blades were slicing through her tender feet. But despite the pain, she smiled at the prince. The prince was very kind to the little mermaid. In the palace, she had everything her heart desired. Her room was lavishly furnished with a velvet canopy bed, a gold-framed mirror, and the most elegant dresses ever made from the finest silk. The little mermaid had never known when she had been happier. One night, the prince gave a grand party for the little mermaid, during which a group of lovely girls sang for the assembled. Afterwards, everyone clapped and smiled. However, the little mermaid's heart sank with a heavy sadness. "Oh, how I wish I could sing for my prince," she thought. But suddenly a thought struck her. Rising from her seat, she took to the ballroom floor and began to dance. She was so graceful and danced as light as a bubble, and after she was finished, the assembled gave her great praise, for they were all entranced, none more so than the prince. "You are so mysterious," he told her, "and you are so beautiful, my silent one. You must never leave my side." The little mermaid smiled. "I never will," she thought. Over the following days, they spent more time together, and the prince found that he was becoming very fond of his silent one. He told her that he had almost died in a storm at sea, but a beautiful young girl had found him on a nearby shore and had rescued him. But he had not seen her since. "You remind me of her," he said. "You both have the same gentle spirit and the same deep blue eyes." The little mermaid knew that it was she who had saved his life, and her heart ached with the silence that bound her. As time passed, the little mermaid grew more and more hopeful that the prince was falling in love with her. But then one day he approached her with news. "My parents have arranged for me to marry a princess from another kingdom, and I wanted to ask if you will be the bridesmaid for my future wife," he asked. Inside, the little mermaid felt a lurch in her stomach, but she nodded. The prince smiled weakly and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he said, "but just so you know, my silent one, I shall never love this girl, for she is not the one who saved me, and she will never remind me as much of her as you do." With those words of promise, they boarded the royal ship and sailed to the next kingdom. Docking the next morning at the foreign kingdom, the prince laid eyes on the princess for the first time, and at once recognized her as the young girl who had rescued him when he was lying on the shore. "It's you!" he exclaimed. "You are the one I've been searching for." Rushing to her, he showered her with many kisses before he held her lovingly in his arms. Turning to the little mermaid, he said, "My wish has finally been granted. I have found what I've been looking for, and I know that you will rejoice with me, because I know how fond you are of me." In that instant, the little mermaid felt her heart break, and she wanted to cry more than ever, but could not. So instead she took the prince's hand and kissed it. The wedding took place on the royal ship. It was indeed a beautiful, joyous, and grand occasion, but the little mermaid did not see the ceremony, hear the wonderful music, or see the merry faces around her, for her mind was consumed by the thought of her death. She knew that after tonight she would never see the prince again, and with this thought in mind she danced for what would be her last time. She moved more splendidly than ever, with a smile on her face, but sorrow in her heart. Later that night, when all had gone to sleep, the little mermaid stood on that ship's deck, leaning her hands on the rail, waiting for the first light of dawn to rise, when she knew death would take her. Just then, her sisters rose from the sea, but how terrible they looked, for their hair, which had once been long and flowing, was cropped from each of their heads. "Dear little sister," they chorused, "we've been to see the sea witch to ask how we might save you, and she told us that you must kill the prince before sunrise, and when his blood splashes on your feet, you will have a tail once more. You can save yourself and come home with us." The little mermaid blinked, her deep blue eyes in confusion. One of her sisters swam up to the ship. "She gave us this dagger in exchange for our lovely hair," she said. "Use it to kill the prince and come back to us. Hurry!" With that, they left the dagger at the little mermaid's feet and vanished as quickly as they had come. The little mermaid cautiously picked up the gleaming dagger and crept quietly below deck. Entering the prince's room, she drew back the curtain that encased both the prince and princess. The dagger trembled in the little mermaid's hand as she held it up and prepared to strike. And suddenly, she lowered the dagger and gently caressed the face of the prince that she loved. Then she turned and left the room. Returning to the deck, she threw the dagger into the ocean. The waters turned black where it fell, and not even stopping to think, she threw herself into the sea. Her body began to lose shape, and she felt it dissolving into foam. Slowly, the sun rose, and its warm rays fell gently on the cold sea foam. But the little mermaid had no sense of death, and suddenly felt herself being lifted into the air. Through the clouds she heard many voices, and then saw hundreds of floating spirit children. "To whom am I coming?" she asked. She had a new voice, and it was more beautiful than any music. "We are the children of the air," they chorused. "We earned souls by doing good on earth, and now you are one of us. Poor little mermaid, you tried so hard and are so good. You loved the prince so much that you were willing to sacrifice your life for his. You will indeed live forever." The little mermaid smiled, then felt something wet on her cheeks. Touching her face, she realized that she was crying for the first time in her life. The little mermaid was so happy that she lifted her arms to the heavens and began to float away with the others. For one moment, she looked back down at the ship below and saw the prince and princess standing on the deck looking out at sea. She blew kisses to both of them, then she faced the light and rose up into the clouds, and for the first time in her life, she felt joy.